Welcome to this explainer. If you've ever stood at the front of a language classroom, or even if you've just sat down to plan a lesson for one, you've definitely faced this dilemma. You've got this brand new, kind of tricky grammar structure to introduce. So what do? Do you just hand your students the rule book right off the bat, or do you let them drive around and sort of figure out the traffic laws for themselves? It's a fundamental pedagogical question, and honestly, it shapes the entire dynamic of your classroom.
Okay, let's dive into this. The great grammar dilemma. Do we explicitly teach the rule, or do we cultivate an environment where students actually discover it on their own? This tug of war between handing over the rule and letting learners figure it out has been fueling academic debates for literally decades. But today, we're going to unpack the research and give you a highly practical guide that you can use in your very next lesson. Here's our roadmap for today. We're starting with the great grammar dilemma, then looking at deductive, top-down teaching, followed by inductive, bottom-up discovery. After that, we'll talk about blending the two for the best results, adapting them to different student levels, and finally setting up your very own classroom experiment. Section 1. The Great Grammar Dilemma. Historically speaking, grammar instruction has a pretty long and varied history. Think back to the early days of education, where grammar was taught super strictly through direct instruction, like the rote memorization of Latin rules. Over the centuries, especially with the rise of modern linguistics, teachers really sought a balance between fluid, communicative skills and strict grammatical accuracy. And this historical tension gave rise to two primary methods. On the left, we have the deductive method. This is essentially a top-down, rule-driven approach that moves from the general theory straight to specific tests. And on the right, the inductive method. This is a bottom-up approach centered around rule discovery, moving from specific observations to general rules. So the crucial point is really the starting line. As applied linguist Scott Thornberry summarized back in 1999, a deductive or rule-driven approach starts with the presentation of a rule, and that's followed by examples. An inductive or rule discovery approach starts with the examples, and from those, the rule is inferred. Keeping this simple distinction in mind is going to really help anchor everything else we talk about today. Moving on to Section 2, deductive, top-down teaching. Now, the deductive approach is incredibly time efficient. If you're teaching highly irregular structures like, say, the exceptions to plural nouns, guessing the rule is pretty much impossible. Handing them the rule directly gives you a high level of teacher control and immediate clarity, which is absolutely great for test prep. But the drawback, well, it can lead to pretty passive learning. Students might memorize that tricky plural rule for Friday's test for sure, but they might forget it completely by Monday, simply because their brains didn't really have to work hard to construct that knowledge. If you want to visualize this in practice, Thornberry provides a really simple three-step framework. Step 1, you explicitly present and explain the rule. For example, add ed to make a regular verb past tense. Step 2, you give clear, specific examples, like walk becomes walked. And Step 3, students practice and produce their own examples. It's clean, it's logical, and it gets straight to the point. Section 3, inductive bottom-up discovery. Flipping the script entirely. The inductive method forces students to analyze patterns on their own. This promotes that absolutely vital linguistic strategy of noticing, which leads to much better long-term retention. Because the learner is doing the heavy cognitive lifting, the lessons really stick. But let's be real for a second. It places heavy demands on you, the teacher. It takes an immense amount of time and energy to plan these discovery sessions, and there's always the risk that a student makes a totally incorrect inference, forcing you to backtrack and correct them on the fly. Dr. Catherine Walter offers a really fascinating perspective on this. She suggests that inductive learning actually taps into the latent grammar knowledge that learners already have buried in their minds. It kind of mimics the way a native speaker inherently knows if a sentence sounds right or wrong without necessarily being able to cite the textbook rule. You aren't just pouring language into them, you're actively drawing it out. Section 4, blending for best results. The good news? Research, like this 2007 study by Haidt, Heron, and Cole, confirms that you really don't have to choose a side. The most effective teaching doesn't live in extremes. The real magic happens when you blend them. You basically get the time efficiency of top-down and the long-term retention of bottom-up. And this brilliantly illustrates what a blended classroom activity looks like specifically for teaching the passive voice. Step 1 is inductive. You write a couple of examples on the board, like the cake was eaten and the letter was written, and you ask your students to analyze them. Step 2, the students collaborate to form hypotheses about what's actually happening to the subject and the verb. Then, in Step 3, you swoop in deductively to provide the formal rule explanation, confirming that yes, the passive voice uses the verb to be plus the past participle. Finally, Step 4 is practice. You hook them with discovery, and then you secure that understanding with explicit clarity.
Section 5. Adapting to student levels.
When you're planning, keep these rules of thumb in mind. For absolute beginners, start deductively. They need those foundational building blocks first, mainly because they just don't have enough of a language framework to make good guesses yet. But for advanced learners, lean inductively to push their cognitive limits and keep them engaged. Also, think about the language itself. If you're teaching highly irregular grammar, like tricky article usage, use deductive teaching. But if the language has highly salient, really consistent patterns, like the basic forms of comparative adjectives, let them discover it inductively.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how demographics play a role. Data from an Iranian university study involving 150 EFL learners shows distinct gender preferences in grammar learning. Look at this. Male students actually scored the highest, a mean of 16, when they were taught inductively. Conversely, female students performed better, a mean of 14.7, when taught deductively, compared to being taught inductively. And the lowest performance overall, that was males taught deductively. This really highlights that there is absolutely no one-size-fits-all approach here. Knowing your students is literally just as important as knowing your grammar.
Finally, Section 6, your next classroom experiment.
So here is a mini action research project you can actually run this week, totally inspired by Dr. Walter's guidelines. First, select 3 comparable grammar rules of similar difficulty. In Lesson 1, teach Rule 1 purely deductively. In Lesson 2, teach Rule 2 purely inductively. And in Lesson 3, teach Rule 3 implicitly, meaning no explicit rule focus at all. After that, follow up each lesson with a short test. And importantly, ask your students for feedback on how they liked the lesson and what they found useful. You'll discover exactly what works best for your specific group. You've seen the top-down clarity of the deductive method, the bottom-up discovery of the inductive method, and you now know the absolute power of blending them together. So as you sit down to plan your curriculum for tomorrow morning, ask yourself, how will you teach your next grammar lesson? Will you just hand them the map, or will you let them find the path? Thanks so much for exploring this with us.